Hi, and welcome to this conversation between myself and Professor Wolfram Kinzig. We are grateful to AIEP for having invited us to talk about the ecumenical world, the Christian traditions, and patristic studies. Hi, Wolfram.
Hello, Maria. Hi, Maria, as they say in Denmark.
Yes.
I'm Wolfram Kinzig. I teach church history at the Faculty of Protestant Theology at the University of Bonn, which you can see behind me, the main building of the University of Bonn. And I'm also very grateful for having this opportunity to present our thoughts and our conversation on this topic of ecumenism, ecumenical relations, and patristic studies. Maria, you are also here in Bonn. Why don't you tell me how you got to Bonn? Because this is already part of our theme. I mean, you have a rich biographical experience. You started out in Denmark as a traditional Lutheran, is that fair to say?
More or less traditional, yes. And did my PhD in Aarhus, then came to Germany.
And Aarhus, is that a Lutheran? Would you say that's a Lutheran, or was at the time a Lutheran faculty?
Definitely, yes. Although it has a tradition of also caring a lot about ecumenical relations, with Anne-Marie Aagaard, for instance, as a theologian well known in the ecumenical world. So there was an ecumenical youth group related to the theological faculty. But in Denmark, we don't even distinguish. We don't say it's a Protestant faculty. We just say it's a theological faculty. We cannot imagine anything else than a Lutheran faculty.
Yes, because other denominations are fairly small in Denmark and in Scandinavia in general. Yeah. I mean, they're growing, but they're pretty small. Isn't that the case?
That's yes. So it is.
So you come from a Lutheran background, and so how did this develop? I mean, how did you get into patristics in the first place?
Actually, it is connected to my veneration also of the different Christian traditions, as I think it is for many, and you must tell us about your experiences too. That you learn how rich the Christian tradition is when you get acquainted with the early church, where everything is still in development. So I got interested in patristics and ecumenical studies at around the same time, and then have had the luck of coming to Germany with such a strong scientific theological tradition. And I'm happy to be here now. Also because, as you know more than anyone in Bonn, we also have a focus on ecumenical studies. Please tell us about this, Wolfram.
Yes, I can. First, I want to say that I think we haven't mentioned yet that you are assistant, or as we say, assistentin here in Bonn, at my chair in patristics. And we are glad to have you here because for us, this is also, one has to understand that in Germany, as opposed to many other countries, not as opposed to Denmark, but as opposed to many other countries, first theology is taught at the university, and it is taught along denominational lines. And in Bonn, we are fortunate that we have a faculty of Protestant theology, a faculty of Catholic theology, and even a seminary of Old Catholic theology, which is a small denomination which you may, the Old Catholic Church, which you find in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in Switzerland mainly. And we use this wealth of experience also for our studies. We have a joint, for example, a joint course on ecumenical relations, and so we have many students, which is in English, and we have many students from abroad coming to Bonn, and they learn from us how we do theology, and we learn from them how they do theology, and they literally come from all corners of the world. And So over the last 10 or 15 years, we've built up a lot of ecumenical experience here.
Mm-hmm.
But this is not really about Bonn. It's about the relationship between patristics and ecumenism. And what do you think, Maria? What is ecumenical, or what from your experience so far, what has been ecumenical about patristic studies? To what extent is it ecumenical?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think it can be ecumenical if you make it, but of course you can also use it to simply form your own identity even more within your own confession. But for me, it has been the gift of understanding that I share a spiritual heritage with the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, especially. Understanding that we are in one way of the same church family. I think they respect a lot that we also have a historical conscience in the Lutheran tradition. Sometimes I think there is a prejudice that Lutherans only begin their church history from the Reformation and onwards. So I feel a sense of respect and happiness when they hear that we do also take our common history serious. Okay. Yeah. What is your experience, Wolfram?
Well, I started out at Heidelberg University in the late 1970s, and that was, in Heidelberg there's only a faculty of Protestant theology, but it's in a way, it's a sort of broadly, at the time it was a broadly liberal faculty with lots of Protestant denominations represented in the staff. Right, it wasn't a particular denomination. And then in 1981, I went to Lausanne and did a year abroad. And there, it was a reformed tradition. And Lausanne being very close to Geneva, it was Calvinist rather, I mean, to a certain extent, Calvinist rather than Zwinglian reformed. And but at the same time, also there was among the students a strong evangelical, a charismatic group, which was for me quite unusual, which I didn't know from Heidelberg at all. And then later I went to England and taught in England for a very long time, first in Oxford and then in Cambridge. And there I had a strong acquaintance and a very thorough acquaintance, not only with Anglicanism in general, but also with the style of doing theology and of doing church history and of doing patristics in an Anglican setting. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate enough to meet some of the greatest scholars of the time in Oxford and Cambridge. Maurice Wiles, for example, who taught me for a year at Oxford. Christopher Steed, who I met in Cambridge. And then above all, Henry Chadwick, who I also met in both Oxford and Cambridge. And they represent a particular type of scholarship, which is in a sense very Anglican. And Henry was also very much involved in ecumenical talks with the Roman Catholic Church in particular. And he also sort of represented a slightly high church Anglican tradition with lots of liturgy and decorum and music and so forth. I learned from there that doing patristics in this context is very much different from the context I had been doing it, right? In Germany, at the time, patristics was part, and still is, of course, part of theology, but part of church history within theology, right? Mm-hmm. And the church historians were eager to open up their discipline towards other disciplines in terms of methodology, in terms of also content to a certain extent, topics, themes, and they opened it up in particular towards history, right? Mm. And in Britain, this was quite different. Their patristics was partly part of systematic theology. I mean, for example, Maurice Wildes was at heart really a systematic theologian. And church history, if you talked about church history, you would talk about historical discipline, which was then also located in the history department very often, right? And patristics was somehow in between, right? Which was very strange. It was, on the one hand, it was part of systematic theology, and I could explain that for historical reasons. But then also it was part of, especially the Chadwicks, both Owen and Henry Chadwick were, also historians. Owen perhaps even more so than Henry. But they were both. They were historians and they were theologians, but they did patristics always with a very strong sense of theological conviction, theological energy, a theological drive. That was still very much palpable, but with regard to the Catholic Church, and that's not something which I learned so much in Germany. So I got to know the Anglican tradition very thoroughly, up to a point where I even considered being ordained in the Anglican Church. At that point, my academic teacher at Heidelberg, Adolf Martin Ritter, told me, we have to have a serious conversation. So in the end, I wasn't ordained into the Anglican Church. That wasn't really the reason, because at the time I wasn't sure whether I would return to Germany. So the reason really why I didn't get ordained in the end was that I couldn't accept apostolic succession. Right, and I remember having a conversation with my friend Michael Banner at the time, who was at Peterhouse, and he told me, apostolic succession is part of the Anglican heritage, and I said, well, it's not in the 39 articles, but he insisted on that, and I thought, no, apostolic succession is something which I find very, which is not close to my heart, right? So that probably was one of the major reasons why I didn't get ordained in the Anglican Church. And yet, I think the Anglicans were, after the war, right? They were, together with the French, they were really the movers of patristics theology, right? And the opening up in ecumenical terms of patristics. I mean, the French, especially with regard to, because they're Catholics, with regard to the Second Vatican Council, where patristics was doing patristics was a liberating experience, right? Opening up and also finding emancipating themselves from a conservative Catholic theology which had been prevalent before this. And in the Anglican tradition, you've had these enormous men of enormous learning, like William Friend, who I also met at Cambridge, or Chadwick, or Morris, and some others, F.L. Cross, who was more of a New Testament scholar, who also, well, in the case of Henry, he was very Germanophile, which was quite astounding, right? So he went very early to Germany after the war, right, and tried to learn from the German type of doing patristics and integrating this into his own theology. And he also later came very often to Germany. So Britain, to a certain extent, was one of the strong factors in establishing a post-war patristic theology. And you can see that, I mean, most clearly from the establishment of the Patristic Conference in Oxford every 4 years. I mean, this is not by coincidence that this was founded in Britain, right? Mm-hmm. And also the establishment of AIEP, which was founded in France, right? Mm-hmm. And still the statutes, the statutes are in French, right? Mm-hmm. So here you can see that these were, after the war, the two pillars of patristics and ecumenical relations.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting also that the World Council of Churches is founded in 1948. So there's really this Christian drive towards opening up Europe and both patristic and ecumenically at the same.
Yes, patristic studies were also important for keeping relations with the Orthodox tradition across the Iron Curtain, because through church channels, as it were, it was often possible to invite people from the Eastern Bloc countries to the West, and also to go there up to a certain extent, right? So patristic studies, so for example, I mean, when you went to the Patristic Conference, you could meet people from Russia, say, not many, but some, right? And you also, to a certain extent, you had to be careful because this was a very complex political situation. But patristic studies were one of the few areas where ecumenical relations could be maintained, at least to a certain extent, through the Cold War. What was your experience with the Patristic Conference? When did you first come to join the Patristic Conference? What was your first?
Joined the first time in 2011, I think.
2011.
Yeah, okay. So I'm still quite a beginner in that field.
You are a novice.
Yeah. But
so what was your first impression from the conference?
I had an impression that it was huge and very varied, and the program also representing a lot of some very theory-driven presentations with postmodernistic themes, and on the other hand, these heavy orthodox themes in the program. But I understand that actually it's not even as varied as it has been earlier. Or what's your impression, Wolfram?
Yeah, I've just in preparing this conversation, I've looked up when I went there for the first time. That was in 1991, and I thought that was the time when the Patristic Conference and patristic studies in general were opening up, in full swing of opening up towards other disciplines. It was straight after the fall of the wall. I very much remember, there's a very vivid memory of a colleague from Romania talking about Lactantius de Mortibus Persecutorum, and actually breaking into tears in front of the audience, saying that he couldn't read this text other than as a contemporary text. It's a present day text for him, yeah. Right? But when you look at the history of the Patristic Conference, then you can see very clearly how this has changed over the decades. I've recently, for a presentation in another context, I've actually counted the number of contributions at the Patristic Conferences and the languages which were being used. So the second conference of 1955 is the first conference where proceedings were published in the Studia Patristica, and I counted them, and there were 116 contributions in 2 volumes, and 66 were in English. That's 57%. So a bit more than a half of them were in English. A third, 33%, were in French. Only 8%, where I was quite surprised, were in German. These were only 9 papers.
Mm.
But then there were 2 papers in Russian. You will remember my saying you could meet Russians. And there was 1 paper in Italian. Now, this changed in by 1979. This had changed. So I counted again the contributions in 1979. That was the 8th conference. There you have 169 papers, as opposed to 116 before, in 3 volumes. And now you have 67%, so 2/3 in English. You have 22% in French, so that's gone down. You have still 8% in German and 2% in Italian. And now what's interesting is you have 1 paper in Spanish.
Okay.
Now that's now going to change, because then the third sounding I did was with the last. No, not the last one. Yeah, the last one which is published, which is the one of 2015, and there you can see how this has changed. That in terms of disciplines that are represented, you not only have historians, theologians, you have classical philologists, you have archaeologists, you have people doing cultural studies in a broader sense, or religious studies. And this is also, you have a strong influx from the United States. They had always been represented, but the number has gone up enormously, right? So what we have now are, we have published 512 contributions in 24 volumes. 512 contributions, 476 are in English. So 93% of them are in English now. We have only 3% in French. Interestingly, now we have 11 in Spanish, and that is because the number of people coming from Latin American countries has increased enormously. And I think that's a very encouraging, a very good sign. We also have people from now from Japan. We have people. Well, we've always had people from countries like Australia, but these numbers have also gone up. We have people from Eastern countries, Orthodox countries, much more, of course, many more. So they all use English basically, except for some. I mean, there's still some French. There's still now increasing number of Spanish papers. We still have 3 in Italian in 2015, but we only have 4 in German. And 2 of those, one was, I checked, was by an Armenian, and the other one was by someone from Japan. So the Germans have switched to English entirely, and the French to a large extent. What does that mean for the patristic studies? What would you say?
We are slowly opening up to global Christianity, I think. I think it also is because it's not any longer strictly systematical, or the way we do, like we have also opened up our field to other disciplines and other kinds of Christians being raised. I think I would interpret it in that direction. So in that way, we, as community, scholarly community, we are welcoming things that earlier would not have been thought of even as patristics, and probably also are hardly patristics, but would fall into a category of early Christian studies or literary studies or something. So,
do you think we are a scholarly community?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I feel that they are my colleagues, even though we don't come from the same confessions. And
do you think there's a strong sense of identity? Bridging denominational boundaries or other boundaries?
Oh, this is a good question.
national boundaries.
I don't know if there is a strong sense of it, but some sense of it, I think. I do feel it. It's part of my identity, definitely. And I see how it affects how people see me when I am in the ecumenical movement, in that community. So definitely it plays a role for, yeah, what do you think, Wolfram? This is a good question.
Yeah, look, for me, so at first, I would say it's rather the opposite, although I'm not sure whether it's not a good process, right? So when I started out doing patristics, there was as I said before, there was a strong sense. There were two things. One was opening up patristics towards other disciplines, but there was still a strong sense this is a theological. There is a theological side to it, right? Finding the roots of theology, finding common roots. Not all of them, but we were talking about a joint theological heritage. Perhaps that's the right way of phrasing it. And my impression was that through the opening up of patristics towards literary studies, towards archaeology, towards cultural studies, or even post-colonial studies, perhaps, this sense of, as it were, studying a joint heritage. I wouldn't say it hasn't entirely disappeared, but it's not as strong as it used to be. But you could also say, I mean, it's not as narrow as it used to be, right? It's wider, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this. My impression is that for my church, or the churches which I can, where I have a certain knowledge of, the importance of patristics has gone down for the churches. And that I find slightly worrisome.
Do you feel this has changed since you say nowadays?
Yes, I think that has changed over the last decades. I mean, in my experience, I mean, you can see that, for example, from the number of publications dealing with the subject. This was a strong. There was a strong interest in sort of hardcore, as it were, history of dogma until the early 1990s, perhaps, and then this went down to a certain extent. It never disappeared. It never. I mean, there were also scholars interested in that after that, but it's sort of my experience is that it went down, and it seems now to be on the rise again, but in another direction, as it were. It's not a critical appropriation of a theological heritage, but quite often also a reaffirmation of one's own denominational identity. And I think you then get sometimes the feeling that it's like almost a kind of neo-orthodoxy, as it were. When I first went to Oxford, I mean, you couldn't talk about heresy other than in inverted commas. I mean, we would always talk about heresy, right? Nowadays, you know, there are some colleagues where they can talk about heresy and just drop the inverted commas. There's something one would have to consider. On the other hand, you also have, especially with scholars from the United States, but also to a certain extent from Britain, you have those who think that patristics are literary studies, cultural studies, right? They have themes which we would never have considered, like the body or food or gender studies, of course. And so that may be a very good thing as well.
Yeah, but you're right. There are the field is getting fragmented in that way.
Enormously, yes.
Yeah, so that they cannot even talk to each other, all of the participants in the scholarly community.
That's right. You have completely different language games.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, exactly.
And that was different certainly in the 60s, in the 50s, 60s, and up to a certain extent into the 1970s. Right? Mm-hmm. It's gradually changed over the last decades. Let's perhaps move on towards the importance of patristics to ecumenical relations today, right? You have a rich experience with working with ecumenical group within the ecumenical movement. Where do you think patristics comes in terms of themes? Does it come in at all?
Yeah, good question. I wanted to mention that it plays a big role, of course, often, however, in a bit of a weak way, I would say, because it's not so, the studies are not so deep, but it's more we do share sense of the meaning of even the early history. And I just also wanted to show the book from the World Council of Churches, Confessing the One Faith, which is a study of the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Or now I say a study, it's more like what can we learn today from the creed? But I just brought it to like show that it does play a role also like as a criteria for all ecumenical work, and that the church is, as it says in the creed, one holy Catholic apostolic. It's a principle in the World Council of Churches and in the wider ecumenical movement. But often I think it's a little bit superficial how we deal with the tradition. I think there could be something done in making the conversation more fruitful between in the ecumenical movement when they deal with patristics. And I could only come up with a few examples where they really have taken a scientific insight or academic insight from New Testament studies and patristics and made it into something fruitful in the conversation. And this was the idea of the episcope and episcopos as not to be seen as identical things. And this was, insights in the later part of the 20th century in academic circles. And then it found its way into ecumenical discussions, and we find these distinctions in the Meissen agreement between the Anglicans and the German Lutheran churches or Protestant churches, and in the Porvo agreement between, again, the Anglican Church of England and Nordic Lutheran churches and Reformed churches, where they try to deal with this topic that you mentioned, the apostolic succession, which is a bit of a problem for Protestant theologians in the Lutheran and Reformed tradition. But then by talking about what is the role of the bishop, even in the early church, the way the church was led, the leadership of the church was plural and collegial. So this is something I find is fruitful when we really look at the words. What does it say in the New Testament? How was this interpreted in the early church?
But isn't it interesting that when you look at the history of the ministry in the early church, and you go to the earliest church, let's say the first 3 centuries, or perhaps only the first 2 centuries, then you have ideas of the church, as far as you can discern them anyway. You have ideas of the church which are neither congruent with what you have in the Roman Catholic Church nowadays, nor with what you have in the Protestant churches. You don't find, and that's one of the, I think, the achievements of historical critical study, you don't find an apostolic succession, right? Right, the idea of apostolic succession right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. So it's not Roman Catholic, right? but at the same time, you don't find a sort of democratic sense of synodal, presbyterial idea of the church as it is found in the Protestant churches nowadays, right? So what does this mean for the isn't there, it seems to me there is a problem here, right? In that if both denominations took themselves seriously, and if they think, which they don't have to do, that the origins have some sort of a normative significance, right? Then they would have to reconsider their own idea, their own ecclesiology.
Yeah, definitely.
It doesn't really happen, does it?
But I do see that these processes are so long. I think this is happening in the 20th century, is the century of renewed ecclesiological thinking, with the Vatican II as like a prime example. So I am hopeful that this kind of thinking will continue, and when we also include the newer charismatic waves and churches, we'll have to really rethink again what does it mean to be church, and can we come to some kind of agreement? Not that
what do you think charismatic traditions or evangelical traditions, which to my mind have become stronger,
definitely
in patristics, in the New Testament, this seems to me to be quite clear in biblical studies, but also up to a point now in patristics. What do you think the contribution of those traditions is towards the study of patristics?
Good question. I unfortunately, in those movements, there is often this kind of ahistorical thinking, so that I hope that we will see more studies from Pentecostal patristics. It would take the patristic studies in a direction towards the relevance for the church of patristics.
I think it's important that we are being reminded that there is a charismatic tradition within church history in general, and also in patristics. I mean, take Montholism, for example, or other smaller groups. It was always to a certain extent on the margin, but even in the New Testament, you have testimony of charismatic groups within the early communities, right? And so it's part of our heritage, and it may be an interesting can you say that, corrective?
Yes.
Maybe a correction, if you become too one-sided, right, in your interests in patristics. So I think that's a good thing. But I also agree with you that that they have some catching up to do in terms of methodology. Very often you find a close reading of texts without them being set, also in the Orthodox, among certain Orthodox scholars, they do close reading of texts, but they don't set it into a historical horizon, within this historical setting, within a horizon of plausibility, if you like, right? Yes, the same is true for those people doing literary studies. They then do rhetorical analysis of texts, which I find quite fascinating, because I'm interested in this sort of thing. But it's not history, right? It's rhetorical analysis. It's literary studies, which is fair enough. But it's always becomes slightly worrisome to me if it's one rather than the other. Right? And there are certain tendencies also towards, as I said before, towards a certain neo-orthodoxy, which I think we should beware of.
Yes.
Yeah, but what do you also think about the future of patristic studies with regard to ecumenical relations?
I think there can be a fruitful dialogue for many years to come. I think maybe the patristic should, maybe it should come from us also, that we show what we have to contribute with.
So what do you think we've made, which means, I mean, I belong among the class of old white men, right? What do you think, have we neglected what we should have done?
No, I don't think so, because I see also on the one hand, we are pressured by the life at the universities. There are increasing demands for professors and for making their research relevant in the context of the university. And on the other hand, yeah, then there is society at large, and then there is a church. I think it is difficult to navigate in, and I think
the gulf has widened between theology, academic theology, and the churches that I know, right?
Yeah.
The gulf has widened.
Yes.
And I often think, what mistakes have we made? Or to what extent have we contributed? I think one of the reasons is that we have become ever more specialized, right?
Yeah.
Very difficult for many people working in the churches to understand, right? Why this is everything to do with patristics is quickly very complicated.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that one of the reasons?
That's definitely one of the reasons. And so often we speak as theologians with words that we borrow from other sciences, which makes sense, but it makes sometimes our language hard, I think, for the churchgoers to decipher.
I have an interesting experience just these past days. We have a project here, as you know, translating the Acts of Ephesus 431, Third Ecumenical Council into German, and writing a commentary on this. And so that a lot of that is Cyril of Alexandria, right? I'm discussing this with my collaborators, how to translate Cyril into German. I mean, not in terms of translating from one language to another, but translating in such a way that not only specialists can understand it.
Yes.
I mean, this concerns the length of sentences, for example, or whether you use hypotaxis or parataxis, or whether you use the subjunctive, right? To what extent you use the subjunctive. And still, I'm quite sure that in the end, nobody will read it than those who are seriously interested and have a certain knowledge beforehand. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we are facing at the moment, that on both sides, that in the churches you have little interest in making the effort of trying to understand what they're saying. And on our side, you have the problem that we are not making the effort of to communicate our findings to the churches at large.
Yeah, I totally agree. The problem is on both sides, so to say, and so also the task.
My feeling is that, I mean, I've worked over now with almost 30 years on the creeds, on and off. And it seems to me that there you have a renewed, I think, perhaps I'm mistaken, but there may be a renewed interest in the creeds, in ecumenism at large. I think that when you look at the Creed of Constantinople, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, then arguably this is the most influential text in Christendom after the Bible, right? And this doesn't simply go away, right? It may sort of go to the background, but it's still, especially in the Orthodox churches, but not only in the Orthodox church, it steers and regulates theological thought in a way which we in the West especially have to become aware of, and this could still serve as a bridge among denominational divides, right? And we can also, I mean, if you take this, for example, it's clear, for example, that the filioque controversy is no longer, in historical terms, is no longer a problem, right? Because it's clear the filioque wasn't there in the beginning, right? It's a later addition. And it's not interesting either, actually, whether it's in the text or whether it isn't in the text. What is interesting is the Trinitarian theology behind it and the Christology behind it, right? And that's something which doesn't go away, I think. And it seems to me, it went into the background, but it seems to me that nowadays I can see a slight rise in interest in this again. I may be mistaken, but so in that respect, I'm quite hopeful, actually, that that we still have something to contribute towards ecumenical relations.
Yeah, and simply that in the creed you have the Trinitarian pattern, as you say, that really structures our faith or the things we believe. So it will remain relevant, definitely. No, I in that sense, I'm very optimistic. And
oh, that's good.
Yes, no. But Wolfram, what is your experience when now your publications on the creeds, are they received differently by different by scholars in different confessional contexts? Is this clear?
Yes, I understand. I don't know. I think first there's a lot of curiosity, and people of a younger generation wanting to know and starting to understand why this is a fascinating topic, right? And why it is interesting to, I mean, and intellectually challenging, but also in an odd way satisfying to understand certain finer details of Trinitarian debate in the 4th or Christological debate in the 5th and following centuries, up to a point, I would say, right? It becomes slightly eccentric also, but I do think even among students I find a great openness among our students here with regard to these questions, especially among the bright students who then later go on to into academia as well. And so what I would wish is that discussions about the ministry and about the church, as I said before, would again be high on the agenda, and what we can learn and what all sides can learn from the early church, right? And also questions about, I mean, what normativity of the fathers? I mean, are the fathers still our fathers, or are they simply other theologians? Should they be our fathers? To what extent should we orient, should we focus our own thought or base our own thought on the fathers, right? Or does that make sense at all? I mean, are we interested still in the spirituality of the fathers, as Robert Wilken said? And I'd say this is a complex question. There are no easy answers to that, but I would welcome a discussion on that.
And
you see what I mean?
Yes, and then we could definitely be in conversation with our Orthodox colleagues about such questions.
Yes.
With the normativity. These are.
For them, of course, this plays a much bigger role as part of their normative sort of heritage than for us. And I think it's a two-way process, right? For them to see that their fathers live in a world which is very much different from ours, right?
Yes.
And they had different challenges than we have today, and we have to learn that our high regard for Luther and nowadays Schleiermacher and not even Barth anymore, right? especially Schleiermacher, is only one, small segment of a rich theological tradition, and even Schleiermacher, of course, is based on the fathers, as is much of German 19th century philosophy.
Yeah.
Right? Many of those were trained theologians and had read the fathers. Yeah.
But now you mentioned Barth, who is, I don't know, maybe getting a bit out of our horizon again, but he was also kind of a neo-orthodox in one particular way. So in a way, yeah, we learn from those who are willing to point to the sources, and then on the other hand, we have to be so critical. It's difficult, but it's just to say that it's not altogether bad that there is this orthodox emphasis in what we're doing when we can deal with it critically.
No, it's finding out where we come from, and that's one thing, learning from where we come from, and also liberating us from where we come from.
Yeah.
It's both. It's a dialectical, I think it's a dialectical process.
Yeah.
So we can learn from, now let's say again, Cyril of Alexandria, we can learn about the finer details of why it makes sense to consider incarnation, right? The philosophical implications or theological implications of the incarnation. I think that's something we can learn from Cyril. But we can no longer simply reiterate what he said about this, because this is so alien from our world and our horizon and our discourses that we simply cannot, as some colleagues do, right? We simply cannot reiterate what he said or paraphrase what he said. We have to reformulate this in new parameters, within new parameters.
Translate in the deepest sense of the word.
Yeah, translate and transform.
Yeah. Yes.
As well.
Yeah.
It's not just translating; it's transforming it. Right. There are certain things where you can, and we don't have the time here to discuss this. Where I think we could discuss, or whether it is possible to have an idea of redemption as in Cyril. I don't think this works, or in Athanasius, right? The idea of a redemption in Athanasius is completely different from the way we would have to phrase it nowadays.
Yeah. Oh, this is an interesting topic.
Yeah, but this is a topic for another. It's another conversation.